Hey guys, thank you so much for joining us for this episode of The Debrief. Super excited to have my new friend, Noah's family, but not him, Dr. Gregg Ten Elshof, and just an incredible professor at Biola University, somebody I've tracked from a distance, not a stalker, but have tracked your career, especially from your mom, just so proud, and super excited and I don't know where I came across your writings, but it was either a podcast, I think it was actually an article in Biola's alumni magazine. Mm-hmm. And I read about you and I went, oh my gosh, this is what I've been saying for years. So you're just bright enough to actually put it in book form. I just complain about it. But just this whole idea that shame is not a totally bad thing. And that's the culture in which we live, where all shame is just awful and terrible. And I've been telling our church for years that one of the disservices we're doing to our younger generation is we haven't given them a category to process shame because we tell them they shouldn't feel it. Yeah. There's nothing shameful about you. And I'm a fan of Jordan Peterson. He just talks about how terrible it is to tell a kid, you shouldn't change. You're perfect the way you are. And it's like, you're not even close to what you should be yet. And we should grow and change. And for me personally, shame was a huge part of my transformation. It's what led me to repentance. It's what led me to just really, I need something outside of myself to change myself. Yeah. And so today, hopefully we can talk about this fine line between guilt and shame. Yeah, and good. I feel like people, have these crazy definitions, and for me, it's blurry. I'm not ever sure where one begins and one ends. But just kind of introduce yourself to our debrief audience. There's about 6,000 people that download this podcast, and kind of infinity forever on the internet. This will exist forever.
Scary.
But why did you even think I need to write about shame?
Well, thank you for having me on the show. It's an honor to be here. I got sort of dragged into a trip to China, my first trip to China back in 2005, and didn't know anything about Chinese culture, history, the wisdom traditions of China. But I got there and I learned something about it, and I was sort of taken by this vision that the gospel, if it's to be effective in a place like China, has to be articulated in categories familiar to the wisdom traditions of the place. Yeah. And so I took up an interest in the wisdom traditions of China, Confucianism in particular, started reading and writing about the relationship between Confucian thought and Christian thought. I found it in many ways beautiful, and I found it to be a helpful corrective to the Western informed Christianity that I'd come up in, and so as I was being sort of taken by a more Confucian informed way of following Jesus, all of this anti-shame literature started breaking out, and I started to notice all of this pervasive anti-shame zeitgeist, this idea that shame is an inherently toxic emotion and that we do well to liberate ourselves from it entirely and so forth. And from a Confucian perspective, this is just absurd. Right. The shame-honor dynamic is right at the center of the moral project, right at the center of the formation of healthy communities. And it's not just the Confucian tradition. It turns out the Western wisdom traditions have valued the shame-honor dynamic as well. So I thought something's got to be wrong here. Right. Something weird is happening, and that got me sort of fascinated. What is going wrong? And what was so compelling for me anyway was my initial sympathy with the shame-honor dynamic, but then I also knew that there was this impressive and growing body of empirical psychological research that correlated felt shame with all kinds of dysfunction, with suicide, with eating disorders, rage, aggression, absence of empathy. And so this for me generated a puzzle. If shame is important, why is felt shame being correlated so strongly with aggression, anxiety, suicide, eating disorders, and the like of that? So that got me into it.
Yeah. Okay. So you came at a different, you landed at a different answer though, because I think that the body of research says shame is bad, but that's not where you landed.
Yeah, that's right. So I came to think that, and continue to think that the social science supporting the idea that shame is inherently bad and toxic is conceptually confused. That and at the heart of the conceptual confusion is the tendency to conflate shame with low self-esteem or self-loathing or other failures of self-respect.
Okay.
Which are toxic.
Right.
So having a low self-esteem is toxic. Self-loathing is toxic. Failures of self-respect are toxic. And if you've been taught that shame just is thinking really badly about yourself, failing to respect yourself, then of course you'll think that shame is toxic,
right.
and you should.
Yeah.
Right. But then that just leaves out this very important moral emotion that's informed both East and West for millennia, and which has been called shame.
Yeah. So I've been told, and I'm not a psychologist, sociologist, or even a philosopher. So the working definition that I've been given, the difference between shame and guilt is guilt is I've done something bad. Shame is I am bad. So let's start with that, and then let's move into the discussion of the Christian moral ethic, which is it's not just that I sin, but I am a sinner.
Yeah.
And so I see all these Christian people trying to separate this, and I'm confused because I'm like, so where do you draw the line between guilt and shame?
Good. So the kernel of truth in what you've heard about guilt and shame is that guilt takes aim at behavior.
Right.
So you're guilty for things that you've done, and shame takes aim at the person. So it's an emotion directed upon yourself, not necessarily directed upon something that you've done. So that's the kernel of truth in it. But there are lots of negative emotions directed upon yourself, which are not shame, like low self-esteem, self-loathing, and the like of that. And so we need to be more specific about what shame is and isn't if we're going to learn what its place is in healthy communities. And so I think the best place to start is here. Shame and guilt, like so many emotions, you have a word like shame that names both a condition and a feeling. Right. So start with the condition. To be in shame, to have fallen into shame, is to be socially discredited in a community of people. So to be shamed is we have lots of metaphors for this. To lose face, to be a person of lesser consequence, to be less weighty in your community. That's to undergo shame. And the opposite is honor. If you acquire social credit, you're a person of greater consequence. We call that being honored. And then felt shame. If you lose credit in a community of people that matters to you, that hurts. Right. There's a kind of sting associated with that, and that particular kind of hurt is called felt shame. Right. It's called feeling shame. So guilt then, whereas shame is a matter of losing social credit and the bad feeling that goes with that. Guilt is a matter of having violated a standard. Right? And so you can be legally guilty if you violate the law. You can be guilty of cheating in a game if you violate the standards of the game that you're playing. You can be morally guilty if you violate the moral standard. And these overlap but come apart in various ways. You can be legally guilty but not morally guilty, and so forth. So guilt is when you violate a standard, and you'll feel guilty if you know that you violated a standard and you care about that standard. Then there'll be a bad feeling associated with that. So felt guilt is that bad feeling that you get when you violate a standard that you care about. Felt shame is that bad feeling that you get when you lose standing in a community that you care about, where you want to have standing.
So that's interesting. So I think our society, according to your definition, has almost no shared guilt, and yet we rail against, because the standard is questioned. So you and I's Judeo-Christian ethic, throw that out. I mean, I feel guilty when I do things based upon how I was raised, but I live in a society that has not been raised according to that standard. But the shame thing is interesting because I think there's so much coming out of our culture where we should not experience shame, and yet it throws it, slings it. The social pressure and social shaming is rampant against celebrities, politicians, religious leaders. Teenagers on TikTok. It's just so interesting that we have this society that's saying two things. You should not feel shame. Shame is bad, and yet slings it like we're addicts, to it. So how do we explain that?
What I've argued is that we've got the dynamic that you're describing has got things exactly backwards. And so we've become increasingly suspicious of shame as an emotion, saying it's bad for you, it's toxic and whatever. But we've become increasingly accepting of shaming as a strategy for pushing forward our favorite social agenda or what have you. And my own view is that we should be less suspicious of shame, recognizing that it's just one of the emotions God's given us to lead us into health and flourishing. And we should be far more suspicious of shaming as an activity. And the reason I think we should be more suspicious of shaming is because it's very difficult to shame someone as an act of love for that person.
Right. Yeah. I think that'll preach. That's good. Yeah.
So how did this happen, you ask? I think part of the reason it happened is because with the rise of social media, the power of shaming, it got kind of a power boost. My kids are into gaming. So we talk about getting power boosts. It used to be that with the activity of shaming, you could diminish someone in a community of thus and such size, depending on how much voice you have. Now, with a few characters, you can diminish someone in the community of human beings writ large. It's an enormously powerful tool, in the way that it wasn't an enormously powerful tool 20 years ago. And when a tool gets more powerful, it's more likely to be used for better or worse.
It's almost addicting.
So that's right.
So, I don't know if you did any research on just the number of times the words translated in English, shame, is in the Bible, but when I looked at it, it's over 161 times. My expertise is more in Hebrew than in Greek. So in Hebrew, it's kalam and bush. The word bush, like we would say tree. And then in Greek, it's like multiple different ways. The feeling of shame, but then it's translated differently when someone's putting it on you. So when you looked at Scripture, you see our English word shame in the Bible 161 times. So it's something that's talked about. So for us to live in a society where we just diminish it and push it away, I think is a miss. If God thought, hey, 161 times, we're going to talk about this issue. And for me, I don't know if you're familiar at all with the Enneagram. And I know you're a professor at Biola, so this is hilarious, right? So some of your colleagues have recently come out against the Enneagram, which is fine, but that I was introduced to it at Biola in my spiritual formation classes. Not to put any pressure, but I just think that's hilarious. I actually had a professor in the doctoral.
I better let you do all the talking about the Enneagram then.
I had a professor at Talbot say, "The Lord told me you're supposed to read this." And that was interesting. I was like, wow. So, and I read it, and it changed my life. But the 3 on the Enneagram, the core underlying issue is shame. So I try to achieve to cover this sense of shame. So through success, through notoriety, fame, money, clothing. And I've seen that. I mean, from the time that I was in 4th grade, I remember telling my parents, I'm not going to wear those clothes that you buy. I will not wear Kmart clothing. And young people, they don't know Kmart, but like Walmart. And if you shop at Walmart, that's fine. I'm just saying, as a young person, I was so concerned with how I dressed. And it's because I didn't have the language that I felt like something was wrong with me if I didn't present wealth, success, label. And so for me, shame has been a huge thing. Paul says, all who call upon his name in Romans will not be put to shame. And so how do I live that out on a daily basis? And so it's been for me a powerful thing. And I shared with you, instrumental in my coming to Christ. And I think this is what we're seeing in our churches when we tell young people, oh, you're perfect the way you are. Why would they ever come to the cross? Why do we need Jesus? Why do we need a Savior? Why do we need to be born again if we're perfect the way we are? And then I see these young people who know that. They know intrinsically that's not true. So they cut themselves, hurt themselves, have suicidal ideation, because there's not a platform to tell your parents or your loved ones, I think something's wrong. And that's where I said, and that's where we take our children to the cross. And the horrific nature of the cross is where we take that shame and where we take those things the things that Paul says in Romans 7 that we wish we could change, but we cannot no matter how hard we try.
Yeah.
Who will save me from this body of sin and death? Thank God, Jesus Christ our Lord. I mean, so much of the beauty of Romans 8 is missed at the ending of Romans 7. And so when you kind of chop up guilt and shame, you know, I'm an evangelist. That's my heart. We are guilty according to the law. Mm-hmm. So that's one of the challenges as an evangelist. We live in a culture that rejects the law that I believe proclaims us as guilty. So, and we're seeing that across the board. We're seeing a rejection of traditional American law. Mm-hmm. Like if the law is seen as unfair to one ethnic group or not, or it's thrown out. Yeah. So it's interesting. Even not just biblical law, but even our cultural laws. Some things are deemed okay because the law is unfair. And so, how do you see shame as an integral part of the Christian's life, really to draw them to God? I mean, did you see any connection in that? Because that's really my heart is, how do I feel these bad emotions and then run to Jesus?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, good.
I know, sorry, I didn't.
There's a lot
and just so you
there.
guys know, I didn't prep him for any of this. This is just a conversation, yeah.
Yeah, so to the point about a quick point about the scriptures and the what did you say, 160 instances?
161,
I didn't count them up in the way that you did. That's nice. It'd be a shock if that weren't the case.
Right.
Because the cultures in which the scriptures were written were heavily informed by the shame honor dynamic. So of course, shame is gonna loom large in the minds and in the writings of the authors of Scripture, right from the beginning with the shame of Adam and Eve and the hiding nakedness and so forth. Shame looms large. Jeremiah talks about the people having lost their ability to blush, right? And I think that's a really nice image of shamelessness. Yeah. Right. To be shameless is to have lost your ability to blush, where blushing would be
which is a bad thing, according to the Scriptures.
That's right.
But our culture says it's a good thing to not be ashamed.
That's right. There's another book out by an author named Nadia Bolz-Weber recently called Shameless, where shamelessness, as she understands it, names a kind of a laudable condition, something that we ought to aspire to. So just a polar opposite sort of perspective. But now shame and the cross, I think. It's worth saying, maybe in response to some of the things you said, that not all shame is healthy.
Sure.
Right. So
I thought that was clear in your book. Like, so when it's self-loathing, self-hatred, you said low self-esteem, but it's the rejection of the fact that you were created in the image of God. And so therefore there's something about you, even in a fallen state. I say it this way at Sandals Church. Shame says that you're worthless. The gospel says you were worth Christ. Mm-hmm. So there's an intrinsic value in you, in me. Even as the sinner, God saw something worthy of redemption. So I think part of the story in my tradition, and my tradition was more of a Calvinistic, depraved, there's nothing good in you, which I reject now. Yeah. I think there's nothing in me worthy of salvation. I cannot earn my salvation. And I think that's what my understanding of the gospel of not the gospel, but just this idea that, I am depraved. That's my understanding of depravity now. I cannot earn my salvation. And so self-righteousness is not a good thing. Yeah. But going the other way, like we talked about in Genesis 3, it says Adam and Eve experienced shame, and God says, who told you that you were naked? Yeah. So that condemnation is not coming from God at that moment.
That's right.
It's coming from something in themselves that says, I am so hideous that I've been naked up to this point, but now I must cover myself because there's something wrong with me. And, oh, by the way, this person that I've been with, I must cover myself as well. Yeah. And that didn't come from the Lord. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's right. One of the things I appreciate about what Brene Brown and others are doing is that they're alerting people to the fact that the hiding that we see first in the garden is not the way out of shame. That's right. That's the way into further dysfunction. And so the way out of shame, I think, is to be honored. Right? So I think one of the powerful things about the cross, and the reason the cross is so fundamental to shame, is because if you have suffered shame, if you've become, think about somebody who is of very little standing in society, and we can think of categories of people who just have no standing. They're not the people that you go to when you want insight or power or whatever. Insofar as they've fallen into shame, the way out for them is for someone of high standing to condescend, to identify with them, right? And when someone of high standing condescends to identify with someone of low standing, two things happen. The person of high standing risks shame, because by association with the person of low standing, they themselves might lose standing.
Right.
But if they have enough standing, that'll be insignificant. And what'll happen instead is that the person of low standing will be lifted out of their shame.
Right.
So if you take somebody of no standing and then let it go viral that they were yucking it up over lunch with the Pope,
Right.
or something,
Yeah.
right? All of a sudden, that person will be a person of high standing
Right.
in society because of their association with the Pope. So what Jesus does with the incarnation and the cross is he condescends all the way down to the level of fallen human, the fallen human condition, all the way to the point of naked and humiliating crucifixion on a cross, in order to put his arm around us and say, I'm with them. I'm with them. And so the God of the universe came all the way down to the level of naked crucifixion on a cross in order to say, I'm with them. And that's the way out. That's the rescue from shame that I think is so powerful in the cross.
And it's so interesting. I mean, we've never seen anywhere, the penis of Jesus. It cracks me up on the cross, right? We always, so in that moment of sheer humiliation and shame, we have to cover his genitalia because of course the Romans didn't do that. The entire point was humiliation
And shame.
And so, but even in that most sacred moment as the church, we've been unable to look upon Jesus for what he was.
Yeah. That's why I've tried to stop calling it the crucifixion and calling it the naked crucifixion.
Right.
Because that's so central to what happened.
Yeah.
He came all the way down to unutterable levels of shame for the sake of rescuing us.
Huge.
Yeah, huge.
So when is guilt good for the Christian?
Yeah, good. Guilt. So let me. Can I answer a more general question?
Yeah.
So there are all these negative emotions that we'd rather be without.
Yeah, amen.
Feeling guilty, feeling shame, feeling lonely, feeling betrayed. All of these things, we'd rather not. And so, but then you might just, with a moment's reflection, you recognize, okay, but God fitted us with the tendency to feel lonely, to feel betrayed, to feel guilty, to feel shame. Why did he do that? Right? And when is it okay to feel those things? When is it healthy to feel those things? And the way I've come to think of it, I borrowed this from Alan Downs, a psychologist who's written about these things, that these negative emotions are like warning lights.
Yeah.
Right. And so they alert us to the fact that something's amiss in our lives. And so if you are abandoned, if everyone abandons you, right, you've been fitted with a negative emotion that kind of ding, 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 something's wrong. Right? You're without companionship. And that emotion we call loneliness. Or if your partner is unfaithful to you, that hurts. There's a negative emotion, this felt betrayal. Ding, 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 something's wrong. You're missing fidelity, and that motivates you to seek fidelity. If you violate the moral law or a standard that you care about, an emotional warning light goes out. Ding, 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 something's wrong. And that motivates you to get back in step with the moral law. Well, shame is just like that. If you lose standing in community, there's a warning light that goes off and says, you are losing standing. And that hurts. And the reason that hurts is because we're built for community. We're not built to be alone. And so when we lose standing in communities, we're designed with a negative emotion that tells us that's what's going on. Right? So shame is healthy, and guilt is healthy when you have, in fact, when it is in fact alerting you to the fact that you've violated the moral standard. Shame is healthy when it's alerting you to the fact that you're losing standing in communities that matter to you. And that's because on the one side, obedience to the moral law matters. And on the shame side, standing in community matters. contrary to the sort of ideal of rugged individualism that so characterizes the American West, we're not designed to just be our own man and be what we are, regardless of what anybody thinks of us and so forth.
Right.
We're designed to belong to and to be dependent on our standing in communities, especially communities of other Jesus followers.
Why do you think the gospel has done so well in China? Like the underground church is just, we don't even know how large it is because it's underreported. But, have you watched Martin Scorsese's film Silence?
No, I read the book. I haven't seen it.
Yeah. I tell people, make sure it's the happiest day of your life, and have Zoloft ready because
That's right.
because it is just like
story.
I needed counseling after that. But it's one of the greatest films ever. But it's interesting. It's really the story of the gospel taking off in Japan.
Yeah.
And it's with the lowly, the low caste people who were rejected, unloved, unseen. And this gospel message hits the shores of Japan, and it's rejected by the elite, those in power.
Yeah.
And I mean, they kill everyone and anything, to stamp this out because these poor people are so devoted to this Savior that would come low and lift them up. But it's interesting. But look at Korea. I mean, Korea has been transformed with the gospel. China. Even in Vietnam now as we speak. So in these high shame, high honor cultures, the gospel, when it's understood, speaks. And then we look in the West where we've kind of divorced ourselves from shame and honor culture. I mean, I think not completely, but the gospel goes nowhere because nobody feels ashamed and nobody feels guilty and nobody is aspiring to what I would call classical honor. I think we still have it, right? If you're liberal, you wear your mask, you're triple vaxxed, right? You've taken the oath. And if you're conservative, right, no masking, I have an immune system, right? So, I mean, it's still in some sense in these communities, but it's not, I still think in the East, there's a universal sense of shame.
Yeah.
Like in China, like if your child is put to death, they send you a bill for the bullet.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
I mean, think about that. You as a parent have done something wrong.
Yeah.
We talk about the lack of homelessness in Japan. Your family is coming for you with their shoes.
Yeah.
Like this is not happening, because your life is a statement
It's a reflection of us.
It's a reflection of us.
Yeah, that's right.
We're in the West, right? We don't know what to do with this drug addict person with mental illness, and so we just kind of let them go.
Yeah.
But and I'm not saying Japan or Korea. I mean, Korea more so than China, but the gospel is growing there at a faster rate than it is here because there's a culture that understands shame and honor. And whereas here is, I think we've lost that a little bit. You should never feel bad.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Here I'm out of my depth. So
okay.
This is a good question for social scientists and the like, but that's not a reason not to talk about it.
Yeah.
We just say what we
I
think.
never let a lack of expertise prevent me from having an opinion.
Okay, good. I mean, I think part of what's going on is just that it's this old phenomenon that the church thrives where it's persecuted.
Right.
And that has very little to do with
shame and honor.
And the like. So I think partly that's what's going on.
Yeah.
But I also think that the church in the contemporary Anglo-West we're so dominated by this ideal of rugged individualism.
Right.
And I think certainly shame and honor have a really hard time finding a place. If you don't care what other people think about you, then there's no reason to be worried about shame. I mean, shame is just shame and honor are your standing in society.
Well,
Who cares about it?
Yeah, and let me say this. If we don't care what other people think about us, does society even have a shot?
Yeah. And I think to your earlier point, does Jesus following have a shot? Because my own read of the scriptures suggests that there is no such thing as just, or that's putting it a little too strongly, but the way of Jesus is the way of communal, familial pockets of loyalty to Jesus.
Right.
The idea of me and Jesus and him saving me from my sins, and that has very little to do with anyone else, is, I think, just foreign.
No, I agree. I mean, every single week, Greg, I have to beg people to attend community, serve, community, and give.
Yeah.
And all three of those things are foreign to most of the people who consider themselves devoted Christ followers.
Yeah.
I mean, I have no expectations for the non-Christian who's come to church because their marriage is falling apart. They're depressed. They got dragged to church because their niece is getting dedicated, right? Like, I don't have any expectations for them, but I'm arm wrestling every week with Christians who are saying, I'm going to pray about whether or not God is calling me to enter into community, serve, give, and attend. And it's like, we don't need to pray about this. Like, you know, it blows me away. You know, I'll give a call for service, and every church in America is struggling with service right now. Getting people to come, they're afraid of COVID. Getting people to serve because we've been accustomed to, it comes to me. And the church cannot function and should not function outside of serving one another. And then here, it's even huger, is I'm going to serve, but it has to be where I'm called and gifted. Like, imagine a family that works that way. I only serve my wife where I feel called and gifted. Like, we're divorced week 3. Like, it doesn't work that way. And yet, you know, that's where it doesn't matter what the needs of the church are. I'm going to pray about my calling. And it's like,
and I think now this isn't a statement about you or your church or anything like that, but those of us who teach, I think, who have that vocation, have to own the fact that what you're describing is a consequence of a failure of teaching. And the failure of teaching, I think, has looked something like this. We've presented a gospel, which is primarily about a personal sin problem that gets dealt with by a certain kind of confidence that the work of Jesus on the cross would manage that sin problem. That's the gospel. And now everything else is further news or something like that. And so long as we keep preaching that gospel, it seems to me, the kinds of things that you're wanting to come automatically just won't. And so unless we preach a gospel which says the rescue from the fallen human condition is a matter of finding your way into familial, communal pockets of loyalty to Jesus, that's the rescue. If we don't preach that as the gospel, then I think what you're describing is the predictable outcome.
So Sandel's vision is to be real with self, God, and others. And I can't tell you how many Christians have a problem with 2 points in my vision. It's not real with God. They have a problem with real with self, which, you know, we talk about where that came from, and then real with others. Why would you ever preach a gospel that demands authentic community? And I'm like, have you not read all the one another's? And so here's how selfish we've become. People in my church read that and they say, love one another as I've loved you. And they say, well, I do love my husband. I do love my wife. The one another's are not the assumed relationships that even the sinners love. I mean, Jesus says, even sinners are good to those who love them. That's not what I'm calling you to. The one another is the outside of my nuclear family and the people that I'm dependent upon.
That's right.
You know, it's not just a concern for my child, like all of the homeschoolers wait. Like, we're gonna change our entire life to make sure that my child gets a homeschool education to prevent them from being tarnished from the world, but not lift a finger to help and educate all the other families that either A, can't afford that, don't have the intellectual capacity to do that. And I have no calling to those children at Sandals, to over 2,000 of them. 2,000 children coming from broken homes. I mean, varying degrees of socioeconomics, right? You know, like, I have no stake in that. And it's like, wait a minute.
And that's where I think I mean, partly I think, yes, of course, we want to enjoin on people a kind of authenticity in their relationships with others. But at the same time, I think before we can realistically do that, we have to have in place, this is where the shame-honor dynamic comes in. If there are a lot of Christian communities where, I'm sorry, if I'm same-sex attracted, I've got no interest in being authentic about that here, because I know I know what that will do to my standing in this community, and I'll suffer shame. They'll love me, right? But I'll be a lesser person, a person of lesser consequence here. Or if I'm a person with significant mental health issues, or or I'm a person with a significant, even physical impairment, and it's possible for me to cover that up here, you bet I'm going to cover it up.
Right.
Why wouldn't I?
Yeah.
Because if I don't, I'm going to be a person of lesser consequence.
Yeah.
So we have to go out of our way, I think, to create communities that don't shame
Right.
people for things like the direction of their sexual attraction,
Right. Yeah.
or the shape of their body, or these other things, and that's hard work. All of the inertia is in the other direction, Christian and not. I mean, we exist in a culture that downgrades people for things like the shape of their body.
Sure.
You will be a person of lesser consequence, and when a person feels that, when they feel shame because they're of lesser consequence given the shape of their body, we do them such a disservice when we say to them, the problem is that feeling you're having, that felt shame, that's toxic, right? That feeling is unhealthy. No, the feeling is just the warning signal of the reality. The reality is they're people of lesser consequence, and they're feeling the sting of that, right? The shame is on us. How dare we move comfortably in a society where people are thought less of because of the shape of their body, or because they were victims of sexual abuse? That's another big reason that people get shamed. So we need to identify those places in our communities where people are downgraded, right? And we need to proactively. This is where the cross is such a powerful image. We need people who are of high standing to identify strongly with those people, put their arm around them, say, she and I, we're together, right? And until we do that, I think, again, what you're describing is what we should expect. Why would people be authentic when being authentic means they're going to be downgraded and shamed?
Yeah, no, I agree. And I mean, so, I'm not an expert on Brene Brown by any means, but what I understand for her is vulnerability is the way out.
Yeah, and
so I think she says three things. She says silence, secrecy, and she has one other letter that kind of magnifies shame.
Yeah.
So, and so here's the other tension.
But
so,
if I could just say something about that really quickly, vulnerability is not the way out.
Okay.
If you're in a community that will shame you all the more,
right,
when you're vulnerable, right? Vulnerability in a community of mutual acceptance and grace, that's the way out.
Right.
But you can't do that alone.
Yeah.
Right. You're dependent on your community.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you.
No, I mean, that's why you're the guest. And so there's this tension, right, in the church between grace and a moral standard, and I think that we suck on both ends. We suck at giving grace, but at our church, I have probably half my church that has kind of discarded the moral standard.
Yeah.
Oh, well, to each his own. It's like, whoa. So there's two things there. It's we need to give grace, but also truth. And I think we're just terrible at both of those.
Yeah. I think that's right. And I don't have any snappy answers to that, except that insofar as I've experienced something like the other direction of things, it happens when you're shoulder to shoulder with people. If you and I are living in proximity, serving the marginalized together, helping each other out when we can't pay our mortgage, bumping into each other, taking the trash cans out, and so forth. That's the setting where it's possible for me to say, you know what, Matt, this thing you did over here, you don't seem to feel badly about it at all.
Right.
but you should.
Right.
That was a bad business.
Right.
It's when we try to say those things to each other, and our only sort of context for one another is sitting next to each other in a pew on Sunday or something, that I think things just go off the rails.
Yeah, I think that's huge. And especially as a pastor, what I have is when somebody is morally gone off the rails, they want to run them to me, and they want me to make them do what they believe is right.
Yeah.
And I only have authority in so much as the person perceives we have relationship.
Yeah.
This idea that the pastor is the superhero, those are done. Those days are gone. And so, and so I just have to invite people, into wanting wisdom from me, wanting direction from me, but just carte blanche saying, this is right or this is wrong is not helpful to them.
Yeah.
So
all of the one another's that you were talking about earlier, written into, that context, assumed a kind of communal lifestyle that very few in the American context are experiencing. So before we can exhort one another well, before we can love one another, forgive one another, bear one another's burdens, I think we have to be more deeply immersed in one another's lives. We just can't do the one another's if the context is we see each other a couple of times a week at church and then a Bible study or something.
No, I agree. So there was this really powerful moment. Were you guys in the sermon recording last week? So do you remember the guy that was invited up to pray for me? He comes up to pray for me, and he's a pastor at our church. What people don't know is we've been in community group together for years. We have confessed together, prayed together, like challenged one another. And he comes up to pray for me, and he can't get the words out. As a grown man,
that's powerful.
He starts sobbing.
Yeah.
And what it is, it's a genuine love for who he knows I am, and the struggles that he knows I have.
Yeah.
And yet I'm going to stand in the place of God to deliver a message, and how awfully terrifying that is. And I think he ended with, "Dear God, just help him." He just came. He tried to pray this glorious prayer, and it just really fell on. Matt just needs grace right now. And I, as he walked off stage, I made a joke about it, because that's what I do sometimes when, I've got to preach. I can't start sobbing in the beginning of my message. I told everybody, this is why you want to be in community.
Yeah, that's right.
Because he knows my sin, and yet loves me and follows me as pastor. It's this weird thing. And, my dad was a pastor for his entire life. And he tells me all the time, he says, "Matt, if I was half as real as you, I would have been fired at every deacon meeting on a Sunday night." And he just says, sadly, we couldn't.
Yeah.
We couldn't.
Yeah.
And I think our younger people would say, well, why not? Well, he had bills to pay, he had a wife to support, he had 2 boys to feed. Yeah. As pastors, we can only push our congregations. So many of my young people are just aghast at the amount of churches in the South that condone slavery. Mm-hmm. I'm guessing there were many ministers who felt it was wrong, but they could only push their congregation so far before they ended up having their house blown up or whatever else, because culturally we can only, and that is the danger, and that's what Paul says, Timothy, there's coming a time when pastors will only preach what their congregation's itching ears want to hear. Yeah. And we always think that's someone else, but the truth is it's ourselves. And, I have struggled with guilt and shame just as I've looked at how I've managed our church the last 2 years. The polarization of Black Lives Matter versus Make America Great Again. The vaccine, do we shut down? Do we close? And I think that the guilt and shame in that was, I think my tendency was to lead out of fear. Mm-hmm. And some of that's just because I'm an emotional being, and I was genuinely afraid. It's real easy to say you shouldn't lead out of fear when you're not afraid. Yeah. But I was telling people, I have a very, very powerful Christian friend who is he's close to the office of the president. He's connected in ways that I am not connected. Mm-hmm. And I remember he called me on the phone. He said, "Matt, this is like March 1st of 2020. He said, "Matt, this is it. This is the pandemic." He said, 30% of your congregation is going to die. Mm. Got to go. Bye." Oh, hung up. Wow. He just came out of a meeting with the president. I come home. I'm trying to process this. The NBA announces it's canceling the season. Yeah. I'm trying to process this, and then the president comes on TV and says we're going to shut down the entire country. This is unprecedented. Yeah. I did not navigate that well. It was scary. Yeah. And then our governor, regardless of what you think about him in California, I think Trump is overly confident, and that's kind of how he handled things. when I saw Governor Newsom, he was visibly shaken and concerned.
Yeah.
Like it's like when your kid has cancer and you're telling your kid you're gonna be fine.
Yeah.
You're lying. You're hoping, but you're lying. And I saw that, and I think that I made some bad decisions there. Watching the riots because of George Floyd, watching the events of January 6th, and just learn that I too am a human being, and I have to divorce myself from that intentionally and say, okay, Lord, I need to hear from your Spirit. Mm-hmm. And so I've had to process that. Okay, I led poorly, and we've lost thousands of people because of mistakes on both sides.
Yeah,
it's just interesting, and I think to not own that would not be healthy.
Yeah,
but to say, like you said these things are warning lights. My anxiety's been off the charts, and it's because of shame and guilt, I believe, over decisions that I've made.
Yeah,
and knowing that no matter what you make in this political climate, you're going to offend someone.
Yeah,
we're in this series right now called The Healer, and we've used a picture of a painting of Jesus. It's one of the oldest known paintings of him. It's from the 6th century. And I've had people of color offended and angry at me because he's white. And the irony of that is it's painted in Africa and currently in a museum in Africa. So this, we don't know who painted it, but that's where it comes from.
Yeah.
And, you can't even, this is the oldest known painting. And it's that one where he has two faces.
I don't know.
It's bizarre. It's funny. Our creative team altered it because he looked so creepy when you blow him up on the screen. But what it is it's the first painting identifying the two natures of Christ. Oh, so he has two faces.
Yeah.
So that's why one eye, it almost looks like he's a gecko, like his eye is like looking sideways, and it's because he's not who you think he is. And I would say he's not white. He's Middle Eastern. Mm-hmm. But as the painting has faded over the years, he's gotten more white.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's a 6th century painting on wood. It's just incredible. And but even that, and I told this guy, I said, I don't think that's Jesus, just so you know. And so it's been a crazy time. How would you help somebody who's listening to this who feels guilty? How should they navigate that?
Yeah.
And then we'll go shame.
So treat them separately.
Yes.
Yeah. Good.
You don't have to, but
no. I'm happy to. Well, it's hard not to go back and forth. So
yeah. Feel free. You're the expert.
I might violate the rule here.
Violate it.
I mean, the big temptation in guilt is in the direction of self-deception, and the big temptation in shame is in the direction of hiding. Those are the two sort of, if you like, unhealthy ways out or something like that. So if I'm guilty of violating a standard, then one way out of that is to convince myself that the standard doesn't exist, right? And if I can convince myself that the standard doesn't exist, then I won't feel guilty anymore for having, or that it doesn't matter or whatever.
Well, or what about I convince myself that I had a reason to violate?
Yeah, or that I didn't violate it at all.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
So one way out of guilt is, and a very tempting and pervasive way out of guilt is in the direction of self-deception.
Yeah.
And so the person who's feeling guilty, I think the thing to say to the person who isn't, I mean, we've all, I mean, those of us who aren't self-deceived,
right.
It's not hard to point to things that that we're guilty about, is just to be mindful of the pull in the direction of self-deception. Know that there are forces in your psychology that are going to pull you in the direction of self-deception, and that's why it's so important to surround yourself with a community of people with whom you can be authentic without suffering shame, because our body, our community can very often see things about us that we can't. So it's a little bit like, if you're feeling guilty, there's a sense in which good for you. That means things are going the way they ought to. It's like if the person has their hand on the hot stove and they're not feeling pain.
Right.
The first thing we need to fix is the fact that they're not feeling pain. Right. So if you're not feeling guilty for anything, the first thing we need to fix is the fact that you're not feeling guilty, because almost certainly you're in violation of some standard or other that you ought to care about. So if you're feeling guilty, the first thing to say is, beautiful, good, things are going the way they're supposed to. But if you're chronically guilty, or if your guilt isn't matched with an equally or more strongly felt sense of forgiveness and acceptance and embrace, then your guilt will undo you, and you'll be ruined by it. So there's this weird tightrope to walk where we embrace the fact that we're having this painful experience, because that tells us that the warning lights are working. Right. But at the same time, if that's not met with forgiveness, grace, acceptance, and so forth, you're screwed. It's going to undo you. So celebrate the fact that your guilt detector is working. Right. And seek community with Jesus loyalists who will embrace you no matter what, and remind you of the forgiveness that we have in Christ, and so forth.
All right, now shame.
Yeah, so shame, the tendency isn't so much towards self-deception as it is to hiding. So if I'm feeling the sting of being socially diminished, then the temptation is to hide and to not show up. And I think the thing to say to the person in shame is, find communities. And it sounds to me like you're intentional about developing this kind of a community. Find a community of people where you can show up don't just show up anywhere. If you just show up anywhere with all of your junk, you're likely just to be shamed further. And that'll hurt all the more. So find a community of people where you can show up and be confident that you won't be shamed. And then find a community of people who will remind you in powerful ways of God's unending embrace of you, his condescension to you, his naked crucifixion on your behalf, those kinds of things. And then I think we have to say, lest we be sort of overly simplistic or something, if you're suffering from chronic shame, where chronic anything, chronos is this word having to do with time. So to suffer chronic shame or chronic guilt or chronic loneliness or whatever is to have that feeling all the time, regardless of what's happening around you. Right? So if you are just chronically feeling shame, probably you need more that probably you're in a condition that you can't do much about yourself. And so I do think one of the valuable things about the work of people like Brene Brown is they're driving people who suffer from chronic shame to professional help. So there are people who are trained to help people out of these chronic conditions.
In your research, did you discover any connection between shame and anxiety?
No, interestingly, there is. So that's a complicated question. There are two bodies of empirical research, one of which, and I don't know how far into the social science you want to go in this conversation.
Go deep, brother.
Okay, so there are what are called adjective checklist studies of guilt and shame, and what happens in those studies is you just give people a list of adjectives like guilty, ashamed, humiliated, small, wanting to repair damage or whatever. And you tell people, how often do you feel these things, right? And then you try to determine from that who are the guilt-prone people and who are the shame-prone people. And then once you've isolated a guilt-prone population and a shame-prone population, you can ask, is one of those populations more likely to be anxious, right? And so that's the way to correlate shame with anxiety. On the adjective checklist studies like that, shame doesn't correlate with anxiety any more than guilt. Neither of them correlates with anxiety until they get to a certain level of frequency, and then they both correlate with anxiety.
Oh, wow, okay.
So chronic shame and chronic guilt will correlate with anxiety, but guilt and shame at modest levels don't. Okay, there are a whole bunch of problems with those studies. For one thing, most people can't distinguish between remorse, regret, guilt, shame. They sort of look at all those words and think, I don't know, these all sound the same to me. So it's really hard to get reliable data from those things. So there was a shift to what are called scenario-based studies, where instead of giving you a list of adjectives, I give you a scenario. I say something like, you were at work and you broke something. Which of these three responses most closely resembles your own? And response one will be, I'll feel like I need to repair it. the response two will be, I'd feel like quitting my job and hiding away or something like that.
Wow.
And so some of these responses will be coded as shame responses, and others will be coded as guilt responses. And then you isolate your shame-prone people and your guilt-prone people by how they respond to these scenarios. In those studies, right, if you take the shame-prone people from those studies, that does correlate with anxiety in a way that guilt doesn't. So the answer to the question, does shame correlate with anxiety? Well, it depends which of the studies you're depending on. In my own view, part of what I've argued in the book is that these scenario-based studies are the ones that conflate shame and low self-esteem. And so the reason they suggest that shame correlates with anxiety is because they're confusing shame with low self-esteem.
Now give us the name of your book, and where can our listeners get it?
The name of the book is For Shame, and you can get it. It's with Zondervan. You can get it on Amazon, wherever books are sold, I suppose.
How's it doing?
I don't know.
You don't know? Yeah, because I always wonder. Because here's what I think.
It hasn't been out long enough for me to get my first royalty check. So I don't know how many copies have sold.
I think that books like this that people need to read, we tend not to. And so I think that's the struggle with, I mean, we both read books that are great and nobody's heard of it. And you're like, are you kidding me?
I write books that are hard to give to people on Christmas. So I've written a book on self-deception, and who wants to read that? I've written a book on Confucianism, and people think, why bother?
And thanks, Greg, for another gift.
Now shame.
Can I have coal? Can I have coal next year?
Exactly.
But I think that if you want to be awake to yourself, books like this are extraordinarily necessary. And again, don't be afraid of the truth. Jesus is our navigator through that. And I think that people are afraid of what they'll find. And Jesus said, kind of my life verse is, you shall know the truth and the truth shall set you free. Now, what he didn't tell us is it's going to beat you up first. But the end, right, is just this state of awareness. And so the language of the East, consciousness. And I think in the West, we're asleep. And we're convinced that, if I get this new phone, I get this new car, if I have this material gain, somehow I'm going to have this internal peace. And we've really made this unspoken vision statement that if I have everything on the outside, the person that I'm on the inside is going to be happy. And what we're seeing is it's just not true.
One of the things my teacher would often, so my teacher was Dallas Willard at USC, and he would often remind us that verse, you shall know the truth and the truth shall set you free, that's the consequent of a conditional. The conditional is, if you abide in me and my words abide in you, then you'll know the truth and the truth will set you free. And that the reason that's important to point out is because if you're not abiding, then who knows what the truth will do to you. The truth might just undo you. It might just destroy you.
It'll be overwhelming.
That's right. And so here again, the importance of abiding in a community of Jesus loyalists. In that context, you'll increasingly know what the truth is, and the truth will set you free.
I think that's on the building at USC.
Yeah, that's right. On Mudd Hall in the philosophy building.
The smallest building at USC. They are no longer interested in philosophy. I thought that was interesting. Well, when I was trying to find it on the campus of USC, I mean, it's just these monolithic buildings.
Thank you for that reminder. I had forgot that is.
And as you walk in, I just thought it was interesting. In a secular school, there's scripture on the building, in pursuit of truth.
That's the old Wesleyan roots. USC was a Wesleyan school back in the day.
And so much of that, so much of young people today have divorced themselves from just the wisdom and truth of scriptures. When I went to the White House for the first time, and where the president speaks in Congress, he is surrounded by great teachers, and they're great philosophers all around the wall. And directly in front of the president, the largest statue is Moses, the great lawgiver. And there's been this movement at DC to kind of wipe all of these scriptures off and really to divorce ourselves from wisdom, things that have helped us. And, they've created this binary category. Well, if it makes somebody feel bad, it is bad. And it's like, well, that's why shame is not always bad and guilt is not always bad.
That's right.
You should feel bad for the things that you do. And I don't know that there's any hope when you do something bad. All of these, I was talking to a sheriff the other day, and you know, he works in the prison systems, and he obviously has a jaded view of those that are incarcerated because, like, you're immersed in that. But he said the only hope I see is for the prisoner who says, I did something wrong, I feel bad, and I want to change. He said there's no hope for the person who's not guilty, who is set up. He said even if they get out, we'll see him back in here within 6 months to a year.
And even better if they can say, I did something bad, and it wasn't a fluke. The bad thing that I did was a reflection of the person I've become.
Right.
And I need to become a different kind of person so that I don't need to just stop doing bad things. I need to become a different kind of person so that the bad things won't.
Yeah, and I think we believe the devil's press. This was a momentary decision that is not a reflection of who I am or where I'm at. And you know, it's just bizarre how even like pastors will cling to power even in the midst of being caught. And you know, I just, you know, it's just so bizarre, you know, the lack of confession, the lack of authenticity, even when you're just caught. And I just have very little hope for those people because my conversion was a deeply profound moment where I felt guilty, not just for what I had done, but who I was. And I needed to be set free in that moment. And I believed that Jesus would set me free. And that's why I went forward. So I believe that I needed to be set free, and I believe that he would. And it was a life-altering moment for me. And so many Christians are Christian because they were raised in the church, but they've never had that moment. And I think we misstated. I think what we tell people is you need to have an experience with God. And what I think we need to restate is, have you had an experience with yourself? Where you realize, right? So what does the Holy Spirit do? It says it convicts the world of sin and righteousness. That's the work. That's the experience of God is the experience with yourself where you see yourself, like Peter says, depart from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man. No. Come and follow me and I will make you fishers of men. It's this moment of self-awareness where, and that's what I tell people when their life falls apart, when a guy has an affair or a wife has an affair or they steal at work. I say, you need to rejoice in the fact that not of what you've done, but you've become aware of what you can do. And it's profoundly evil. You know, and, you know, and I think, again, this is why Christian community doesn't work, because we all think we're better than we really are. And so we're shocked at the selfishness, the self-righteousness in the church, the unawareness. And, you know, we're not interested in real community where we say we are going to be Jesus loyalists. I like that's what you said. And we're going to pursue community. You know, Jesus was profoundly real. Like I think about, you know, we're approaching Easter where he takes Judas's hand and he dips his hand and he says, go do what you must do in front of everybody. But everybody's so self-consumed, then it turns into an argument over who's the greatest. It's like he just said, you're the guy that's going to do this. You know, it's just so remarkable. And I think we're missing out on the power of the gospel because we've not, again, become real with ourselves. And, you know, even when we want to, you know, as Jesus asked the disciples for prayer, they can't. They just fall asleep. They're broken people. And we need this. Anything that I didn't cover that you want to, you know, that you want people to know either about your book or something that you discovered that you just wish, you know, you just wish somebody could know. Like, here's what you need to know about shame. Is there anything in that? I know you wrote a whole book on it. So what's the nugget?
I think that the nugget is just that if you're feeling shame, think of it like loneliness. If you're feeling lonely, the first thing to ask is, well, is that because I'm alone? And if so, then the feeling is doing what it's supposed to do. If you're feeling shame, the first thing to ask is, have I been diminished in communities that I care about? And if so, then your feelings are doing what they're supposed to do. If you're feeling a whole lot of shame, even though the best you can tell you haven't suffered any diminishing in your communities, then probably something unhealthy is going on, and you ought to get some help.
Absolutely. Well, thanks so much for joining us today. Really appreciate you. Appreciate your work. Maybe in the future we can do this again and talk about Confucius, because that I have to read that book, and it's just incredible. And I'm just grateful that Gregg, you did this work. I think it's pioneering. I think it's needed. Especially so much of the Christian literature. Shame is bad. It's always bad. And I think your separation of toxic shame, or just consistent shame over everything versus, did I do something that I should be ashamed of? I think that's really healthy, because really what we're pressing upon people in our culture is numbness, which is leprosy, which is one of the things that Jesus most often healed people from. The inability to feel pain. And that's one of the miracles that he thought ought to be changed.
That's right.
And so thank you so much. Just really appreciate you, and hope that our listeners will get your book. And Just Connected is wherever books are sold. Zondervan's a great company. So super glad that they want to do good work like this.